कि वीसी बन के थोड़ा ज़्यादा eyeballs नहीं आते like how does it make you feel when everybody is looking up to you?
If you ask me personally, I think the job that founders do is 10x harder or maybe 100x harder than what investors do.
Your pitch deck essentially is you speaking to the investor without being there.
And ideally, I would actually love for people to first write their story down saying, look, my story is point A, B, C, D, E. Art of writing is equal to like the art of thinking clearly, right?
Right. Welcome to the show, guys. Today I have a very, very special guest. I think a lot of us in our team have been trying to figure out, let's try and talk to somebody who's in the VC circle or have been part of investing. And I think I can't find somebody better than Ashray, who's been a very close friend also. And we have worked together at Cred. And I thought, nobody generally try and figures out a lot of aspects of investing, which I thought we'll pick up which we'll pick up today. So welcome to the show, Ashray.
Thanks so much, Sid. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry this took so long to happen, but very excited to be here and look forward to chatting today.
Cool. So let's just get into like the questions we were just, catching up on. I think one of the things we were discussing was like a lot of professions generally लोग अपना अपना काम करते हैं जो लोग किल करते हैं थोड़ा सा उन पे फोकस भी बनता है बट आई ऑलवेज फिगर्ड दैट और थॉट और वंडर्ड कि वीसी बन के थोड़ा ज़्यादा आईबॉल्स नहीं आते लाइक हाउ डज इट मेक यू फील व्हेन एवरीबडी इज लुकिंग अप टू यू probably like if you'll talk to somebody who's really young or starting something सबको लगता है वीसी से बात कराओ आई थिंक इन आवर सर्कल ऑल्सो इन आवर टीम ऑल्सो एवरीबडी वाज एक्साइटेड कि सेड कोई वीसी है क्या कैन वी टॉक टू देम आई एम लाइक ज़्यादा अटेंशन नहीं मिलता है एंड अगर मिलता है तो हाउ डज दैट मेक वन पर्सन फील
Yeah, I think it's actually very true. And oftentimes, I think some of this is also led by, I think, how the media, at least in India, also maybe in other countries, actually covers and focuses on which different stakeholders in the game. I think VCs play a very important role in at least furthering groundbreaking ideas, enabling the best kind of founders. But it's possible that sometimes they may be celebrated perhaps more or part of the discourse more than they should be in some ways. And if you ask me personally, I think the job that founders do is 10x harder or maybe 100x harder than what investors do. Both play very, very important roles, but in my mind, there's no doubt. And I think founders are the bedrock on which everything is built. But perhaps maybe attention may not be divided exactly in that order of importance. I understand the fascination I think a lot of people have. It feels like you have these millions of dollars of funds that you deploy. So in some way, it feels like you're playing God. What I think we should realize at the end of the day is that most investors in India, at least venture capital funds, private equity funds, are managers of someone else's money. You, of course, have some of your own money to have skin in the game, which is called like GP contribution or the investing team's contribution. It's usually a smaller chunk, could be in single digit percentages, some cases 10, 20% and so on. But it's still a smaller chunk of it, and the larger part is actually money that's coming in from external investors who've been doing this for many years, who've deployed money in many fund managers like you. So you are ultimately a fund manager who is raising capital from different investors and deploying it on their behalf. And that is a skill that you're using to identify who are the next set of founders who can actually help you create that sort of return for your investors. So I think it's just that job. But I think given there's this fascination of deploying large amounts of money and the way we celebrate large funding rounds and valuations as opposed to outcomes in some sense, it's somewhat natural that this happens. What I think we should still keep in mind is that, look, it's not your money. You are in a position of power which is given to you by like your investors who placed you on that sort of spot to be a good custodian of their funds and actually do a good job with it. It's always important to remember that it's the founder who's actually going to take that money and create more with it in some sense. And it's always good to remember and stay humble to say that this is just a job that you're doing. And I think every time you speak and meet great founders, you'll of course realize basically like they're the heroes that we're doing. We're playing an enabling role here. And for me personally, I think every time you sit across with a great founder, a lot of these things just come back in perspective. And I think that's been a great leveling exercise. At least I've been through those sinusoidal curves in some sense, in terms of understanding your own self-importance in some way, to now arriving at an equilibrium where I feel I'm somewhat comfortable with what I know my role is in some sense and what I should be doing. So I think it's more clear in my head, but I understand for a lot of young investors this conundrum may exist.
किसी के तो पर कुछ लोगों के तो दिमाग पे चढ़ जाता होगा ना यार, मतलब I understand that you know there is somebody who's actually done really boring, you know, businesses to actually build that capital so that they become investors into a fund, and then somebody will work on it who is the founder you're investing in. बीच में when you're not playing God but feels like playing God, ऐसा किसी के साथ तो होता होगा ना यार.
यार I think होता है, and it often happens with younger folks who have perhaps not experienced the highs and lows of building, highs and lows of operating in some sense. And if this is the first time you're placed in a position of power where you've perhaps not experienced enough highs, lows in some form, some of this may affect you perhaps a little more and you could get carried away in the moment. But I think the answer to a lot of this is just time. A good sobering, at least reality for me, has been being an operator in many sense that just brings all of this in perspective of saying like what is the real hard thing basically here to do. And वो जब hard चीज आप कर रहे हो तो then you're like यार, that empathy for the other side just goes up massively, and then you realize that it is a significantly hard thing to do. And I think that levels you more. I think the answer in a lot of these cases is just time. Yeah. And ultimately I think, and I think the second aspect जो आप बता रहे थे, some of this may have happened earlier in India when capital was more scarce.
Right.
And when capitals were scarce, I would just say investors perhaps may have had more leverage. But I think we've had a phenomenal decade for Indian startups. I think great founders have built great companies, and I think that power equation is much more normalized or moving in the right direction right now. There'll always be a little bit of a tussle because of the roles both of these stakeholders play. But I think that factor, which used to be a bigger factor, I think is also significantly reduced now. And I think that power equation is a much more stable one in, to a large extent. There's of course room for improvement, but that to a large extent, I think that's also what better.
Got it. And look, if I know, and obviously we can speak about your experience also, you've been, you know, you are part of a fund right now with Elevation, and before that, obviously, you know, we were at Cred, which was more on your, like the time was more on the operating side and rather than, you know, investing side. And before that also you were part of the investing, you know, ecosystem where you were with Nexus. You've seen both sides. तो एक टेबल है जहाँ पे, you know, there is a founder, but obviously founder also have their entire corp dev team, investor relationship team, and then there is obviously the fund which, you know, is investing into a startup. You've done both sides. What are like major differences between that, and which side do you like, if you had to pick, what makes you more happy and comfortable in your skin?
Between operating and investing,
Yeah.
or between like more corp dev versus
नहीं,
investing?
मतलब मैं ये कह रहा हूँ, एक जगह पैसा, एक तो देख डिप्लॉय करने वाला हो गया, एक तेरे पास डिप्लॉय हो रहा है. सो यू हैव बीन अ गिवर एज वेल एज अ रिसीवर. मैं ऐसे सोच रहा हूँ, a person might have had the experience of both sides, but might enjoy one side better. And I'm not trying to judge कि भाई तुम किस side में ज़्यादा enjoy करते हो. It's personal nature. What have been your experiences, likes, dislikes, blah blah blah, all of that? I'm trying just to figure out.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. And like when I was, I think, stepping out of Cred and taking a break and figuring out what next, I think this question was running in my mind also a lot. And the way at least I see it is that I have not seen some of these choices personally as very zero sum in nature, that to like something you may not like something else. And I've been fortunate enough that I was, I think, at a time when some of these choices were available in a way where you could say I like both in some sense. It's just that at this point this felt more fun, or the right opportunity came at the right time, but you may actually like both. So I think I've ended up straddling this, because even before Nexus, I was part of a very young startup, and we were operating in the home services space.
Oh yeah.
And so I've done this like a couple of times back and forth. I think I've been very privileged and lucky to have had the chance to say this feels more fun right now, so let's go do this. On the whole, I think I like both, but the choice afterward, after like 5 years of very heads down operating, actually for me it felt like now might be a good time to maybe use a lot of those learnings from those 5 years of like us making mistakes, us doing a lot of things right, and then using that in some way to perhaps be a better partner to founders and be a maybe a better investor. So that's the endeavor. So right now this feels more fun. But yeah, I look forward to doing this. But till now, I think it's been more in the moment kind of decisions of saying that yeah, this is also fun, this is also fun, but this feels more fun right now. So I think I've been lucky enough to have that luxury till now, and right now this feels incredibly fun.
Awesome, awesome. चलो थोड़ा सा ना अभी I just wanted to also deep dive in terms of a lot of questions which I feel generally in media you don't get answers for.
हाँ.
Like one of the things we were discussing also the other day, where look, anybody who's starting something, they are trying to figure out that is this a problem worth solving, and then they come up with a solution. A solution could be a product or service they're building, and then is it like वो solution भी अच्छा हो सकता है, but वो solution मतलब आप उसमें can you do you really have a market big enough to serve and actually make money? All of those things मुझे लगता है जनता को चमक जाती है. They build it also. People who are great product managers, also problem solvers, would come up with that. But a lot of times they are also in their journey, in the very initial phase, are also dependent on external capital. Now, one of the ways, and I think people should keep this in mind, that it's just one of the ways. I think a lot of times it gets celebrated and is thought as the only sole way of actually building your organization. VC and the funds you get, they becoming an investor is one of those ways. They are required to share a lot of pitch decks and all that. And I've met, Ashray, so many people who are like, अच्छा सिड मेरा थोड़ा एक बार pitch deck देख लो. I'm like, भाई, look, your pitch deck essentially is you speaking to the investor without being there. And they're not investing any time, energy, or money also in a lot of cases to ensure that that pitch deck does the best, discussion for you, because that document essentially is discussing with the person. And I'm sure you must be given like a lot of pitch decks must be coming to you. Why do people not treat that document really well? Point one. And how should they treat it? Is like two things which I think nobody talks about. क्योंकि हम लोग हमेशा वो सुनते हैं, अरे इसने तो इतना रेज कर लिया, उसने रेज कर लिया. बट यार माना कि उनका डॉक्यूमेंट बहुत अच्छा होगा, नहीं माना उनका प्रोडक्ट बहुत अच्छा होगा, अपॉर्चुनिटी बहुत बड़ी होगी, बट दीज थिंग्स ऑल्सो मैटर, डोंट दे?
Yeah, I think they actually do, and this is almost like an area which I feel deeply passionate about, because I agree with you that we don't, I personally think the whole ecosystem can do a better job here in terms of understanding what role does, let's say, like a deck play, how do you run some of these interactions a little better, that both sides actually end up with better outcomes in some sense, right?
True.
And I think that understanding of each other a little more, and of saying what are we trying to solve for, what is the objective here, can be much better. And I think breaking those barriers down and improving communication and increasing transparency will, I think, just lead to better outcomes for everyone. So I agree with you. The broader point here, I think, to think through is, I'll break this into twofold, at least. Let's say talking about pitch deck, right?
Okay.
I think a lot of wise people in the past, I think knowledge that we keep hearing from people who are much wiser than us, have come before us, keep saying that the art of writing is equal to like the art of thinking clearly, right?
Right.
I would actually just extend that to say that would also include something like a pitch deck, basically. So the first part, or the first core essential thing to think about here, is that this is a good forcing mechanism for you to articulate in a very short way in terms of what are you really doing, why does this matter, why should, let's say, you as a founder be spending time on this in some sense, is this the best use of your time, is this really a very compelling opportunity, why would this be a good use of someone else's time in some sense, why should someone spend like the next 5 minutes of their life or 10 minutes of their life reading what you have basically shared, right? Understanding those objectives a little better and being able to think through your own strategy of saying, who are you solving for, what are you really solving for them, who is this customer, where do they come from, why will what you do really work, do you have any evidence of that, and so on. All of these will, I think, fall under that bucket of thinking more clearly, thinking more strategically. And the second part is, once let's say you've thought through a lot of the strategic aspects and you know, look, I actually want to communicate ABC. Here is why I'm going to spend the next few years of my life actually going after this. That's clarity part, let's say, sorted for a moment, right? The next part is saying, how do you communicate that clarity in a way that's easily understood by someone else? And appreciating the fact that not all of us may come from same backgrounds. We've all been exposed to different things in life, so we may all have our own biases, we may have our own way of looking at certain things and so on, basis our past learnings and so on. So I would say it's these two aspects. So the first aspect is independent of any investor. I would say the first aspect is very essential to running your own business. वो तो आपको करना ही चाहिए. That is a very existential exercise to do for yourself, to say how, like, you may have tons of compelling ideas in front of you. Why is this the one to go after? And some of these exercises, some people write memos, pitch decks could be one form factor of basically doing something. It will be a great exercise to reinforce to yourself as well, saying this is why I'm doing. Sometimes it may even expose gaps in your own thinking, the process of doing this, and like, oh, maybe I haven't thought of this.
That's why they say ना कि तुम लिखोगे तो generally thought of मतलब clarity थोड़ा आएगा.
Yes.
And by the way, while you were speaking, I also realized कि बहुत बार ना लोग, like, it's similar to me as an employee writing my own CV also at a time. लोग CV भी और ये pitch deck भी ना बहुत after thought की तरह करते हैं. और आप चाह रहे हो कि भाई वो चमत्कारी डॉक्यूमेंट बन जाए and everything goes hunky dory.
Correct.
Which I think is like a big mistake a lot of people do.
Correct.
So, sorry, I didn't want to cut you, but just wanted to extend that, conversation while you were saying that. मुझे लगा CV वाला भी एक point is something people can relate to even if you're not a founder yourself.
Correct. नहीं यार, I think, look, my broader feeling in a lot of those is that oftentimes before we start these exercises, we don't question कि यार कि deck क्यों बनाना चाहिए. Let's say, like, why is deck such a hero thing in a way where all of us just assume that deck तो बनाना ही चाहिए, question ही नहीं करेंगे. I think deck is just a very concise and a more efficient way to communicate what you're doing, why is it interesting, to a third party audience who's basically potentially, in fact, you may make decks to do partnerships, sometimes you may show these decks to potential employees, sometimes you may show this for investors, right? And oftentimes we associate a lot more with, let's say, showing to investors and so on. But the objective of doing this could be very different. For example, I don't think a company or a startup need necessarily make the same deck for a different scenarios in the pitching process. Let me explain what I mean by that.
Okay.
So let's say I am trying to meet with a particular investor. I don't have a very warm relationship or so on. I'm trying to figure out how do I get my relationship, and I'm trying to get heard by someone right now. I may be good at my job, I may be good at my domain, my sector, but I may not necessarily have connections, let's say, with investors, right? So in this case, my first job is actually, let's say, to get a meeting and get a conversation.
Right.
The kind of document in terms of a deck that I should prepare for this scenario, the core objective and the success metric here is saying, how do I get a meeting? Do you want to explain your entire business and go into all kinds of levels of details? Maybe not. I don't think it's a good idea. You may, in fact, a teaser might be a better thing that may work in this context, right? How do you actually spike someone's interest to say, this is worth your time, why don't we meet and discuss more of this? Maybe you need much shorter slides, maybe the narrative that you need is much more punchy, and you're just largely teasing. Just say that, look, if this exciting enough for you. Sometimes it may be like, look, the investors, I don't invest in these sectors. Maybe this is not an area of interest for me, it's not in my scope, and so on. To simplify life a lot. Someone else may be like, look, I'm very excited about this space, and I actually like basis what you're sharing is very exciting for me. It also simplifies their life to be able to get to an answer saying, is this within the scope of what I'm operating, and get to that answer faster. This is, I think, let's say, one job to be done, right? The second one you can think of is to say, look, I actually have an in-person meeting. Oftentimes you see a lot of pitch decks filled with text, filled with images. They're so busy slides, like to the point where you have a very long title, then you have a box here, then you have a box here, then you have something here, you have an infographic here. Ideally, if you say, look, you as a creator of the deck have done a good job in saying, let me convey everything I want to convey. While doing this, what is likely to have happened is that you have not thought of the reader to say, how will the reader read this? What do they read first? How will they actually register 5 different things that you're putting at them? If you have a visual element, if you have a text element, Do you want them to read the visual one first? Do you want to read them to text element first?
So you're saying
you
nobody-
actually dumped cognitive load and saying you're past your problem to become their problem and say you figure out from all of this what do you need to infer, right?
And thus what I'm saying is nobody's thinking, what you're saying is nobody's thinking from a product first perspective.
Yes.
कि भाई वो भी एक product बना रहे हो.
Yes.
You're not being empathetic to the reader.
Look, I think founders are the chief product officers of their own company.
Always.
The deck is a product. The customer of the deck is basically, let's say, investors or whoever is your stakeholder in that scenario. How is it very customer first? Have you engineered your deck to be very customer first, right? The extension to this, like the third kind of scenario is to say that, look, certain kind of investors, let's say, have had experience with some spaces. You can actually bake in that level of personalization in some way to acknowledge their expertise in that space. Some other investors may be new to a space. The kind of, let's say, context setting, context building you may want to do is very different. So you may have to personalize and tailor your stories in a way that it actually suits the reader in that particular scenario, right? For example, for a lot of live presentation where let's say we're both chatting and I'm using slides as an aid to land my point much better.
Right.
Oftentimes what we also do is we repeat the same slides. Like I've written X number of things, I end up doing a voiceover. What most humans actually do is they read much faster than they listen.
Absolutely.
So मैंने पढ़ तो लिया सब कुछ, now I'm waiting है तो ये बात करना खत्म कर. To be respectful to the other person, right? A good founder in this scenario can actually appreciate this, that look, it's likely that a reader will read faster than they listen. So what I'm saying versus what I'm doing is actually not the same thing, but I've structured it in a way where slide plus my voiceover actually adds up to the more cohesive story, and that is the best way of landing the message there, right? For example, an example Apple uses a lot in its keynote is they have those very ultra minimalist lot of slides, right?
One word,
yeah, it's fantastic. So it is so obvious to anyone to say what is the hero message you're landing. Oftentimes I actually ask founders that, yeah, you tell me the so what of your slide, right? Or in like more colloquial terms, like कहना क्या चाहते हो भाई? Like सच में एक लाइन में बोलो कि कहना क्या चाहते हो, and first write that for every slide in your deck. And ideally I would actually love for people to first write their story down saying, look, my story is point A, B, C, D, E. I first write a cohesive story, maybe in text form or whatever, and then I figure out what is the best visual medium to convert that story to land it in the best way, because let's say oftentimes text may not be the best way to land a message. But your storyline should at least be clear in your head, which is the clarity point I was talking about before. Once you get that clarity, then you figure out, look, this is what I want to say. How do I convert this in the best visual format to land that message? I usually encourage people to have only like one hero message per slide, because I feel most people are very attention deficit. You cannot comprehend or you will not register if there's like 2 or 3 key messages in one slide, usually, right? It's okay if you have more slides, but you run through them much faster. And a good test to all of this is to then test it out, let's say on well-wishers and other people, and say, ask them to go through all of this, you do everything, and then say, what did you actually remember? What are you really taking away? In an audience, let's say, who did not have adequate context, and then validate, look, I wanted to say X. Are you actually inferring X here? Is this message landing? Which is a kind of customer feedback and testing, alpha testing, beta testing that you do, right? I think that level of attention to detail, that level of strategic thinking, and extending this to say, look, this is also a product and there is a customer for this product. How do I get the best experience and how do I execute this in the highest attention to detail, customer obsessed way, basically? And all of what we spoke about right now are just ideas in some way, not prescriptive, but some ideas which I've seen work to have better outcomes for everyone.
Yeah, but Ashray, while you were speaking, you helped me imagine the Apple slides, or why let's not talk about just the Apple, like the Samsung slides also. Okay, obviously they're very very minimalistic. There is a person who has a stage, they can speak. बहुत बढ़िया लगता है. I was also thinking of a lot of founders and their slides which I've seen. Not that I've been part of investing, but वो जो एक होता है ना कि गुडविल में आप लोग बोलते हो ना कि अरे तू तो स्टार्टअप में काम किया, थोड़ा थोड़ा आइडिया देखना यार कैसा है. और देयर आर पीपल हु ट्राइंग टू स्टार्ट. अ लॉट ऑफ टाइम्स व्हाट आई हैव सीन इज ये लोग ना एक डायलेमा में होते हैं. एंड आई डोंट नो इफ दैट कम्स अक्रॉस, यू हैव सीन दैट. हो सकता है जो लोग पैसा नहीं रेज करते वही शायद डायलेमा में होते हैं, जो पैसा रेज करते हैं शायद वो कभी डायलेमा में नहीं होते हैं. दे आर ट्राइंग टू prove their point also, and I think that's where I think they are also trying to sell the idea ki bhai please don't try and question me, I'm giving you a lot of proofs, and thus ye dabba wo dabba 25 cheezein, their slides are always stuffed, and thus what happens is when you said na ki एक स्लाइड में एक थॉट होना चाहिए विच इज यू नो दैट वन थॉट इज गेटिंग कन्वेड. अ लॉट ऑफ टाइम्स पीपल जनरली ब्रेक स्लाइड्स इनटू थीम्स, और उस थीम में अपना पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू प्रूव करने के चक्कर में ना वो 5-6 पॉइंट्स डाल रहे होते हैं, और इवन मोर, मतलब आई एम सेइंग 3-4-5 तो होते ही होते हैं. एंड दस आई जनरली हैव सीन अ लॉट ऑफ स्लाइड्स और पीपीटीज वेयर it is supremely wordy, and they're just trying to prove a point. But on the contrary, when you're saying कि ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए, I think a lot of people would, who even understand this point, might feel underconfident. And please let me know if you disagree, कि यार मेरा point ना शायद इतनी सी चीज़ में will it come across to the investor? I think that is one of the dilemma they always suffer. और वो सोचते हैं यार कि ना बताने की बजाय बता ही देते हैं ना. And that's why even people who are more aware about such things also end up putting a lot of extra in their pitch deck. I understand it doesn't help, but इसको solve कैसे करे यार कोई? जैसे मैं एक एग्जांपल देता हूँ, सॉरी मैं एग्जांपल देता हूँ. मान ले एक नया ही कुछ है, ठीक है, अब नाउ बहुत बड़ा बिजनेस है, लाइक फॉर एग्जांपल यार कोई किसी से बोलेगा कि भाई पेमेंट्स बिजनेस पे चले जाओ, फिनटेक में, और पेमेंट्स में अगर आपके पास डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन आ गया उसके बाद आप पर्सनल लोन करो, मतलब ये दिस इज लाइक पूरी दुनिया को पता है, ठीक है. बट अगर मैं कुछ नया ही प्रॉब्लम लेके आया हूँ और उसका सोल्यूशन लेकर आया हूँ एंड विच इज़ रियली रियली यूनिक, तो मैं प्रॉब्लम की भी बढ़िया डिटेलिंग बताऊंगा आपको, सोल्यूशन की भी बड़ी डिटेलिंग बताऊंगा. आई विल ऑलवेज ऑल्सो ट्राई एंड प्रूव कि एक्चुअली इसके जितने सोल्यूशन है उसमें ये सोल्यूशन जो मैं बना रहा हूँ इज द मोस्ट एप्ट सोल्यूशन. इट विल बिकम वर्डी. हाउ डू यू नॉट गेट इन टू दैट issue of not being really boring but still conveying to the investor कि भाई बहुत बढ़िया आइडिया है, let's go ahead with it.
See, yeah, I actually understand where this fear or apprehension for a lot of founders may come from, and I acknowledge and respect where they're coming from, and I also feel that oftentimes a lot of founders also feel that this particular document is such a high stakes document in some sense, right?
Absolutely.
Where you feel like, look, if I get this wrong, then I lose like whatever X number of prospects for my company in some sense. And if I do it right, then there's like, let's say like amazing things in store for me in some way, right? So it almost feels in some way that it is like such a binary risk kind of a dynamic where it's so high stakes, and hence you are, I would say, apprehensive of saying which way do I go, and am I doing everything that I can to improve my odds in this particular scenario, right?
Absolutely my point.
I would basically say that, look, I think I may have observed this a little more at very early stages of companies, basically, like at the earlier stages of fundraisers in their life, right?
ठीक है.
Because as you progress along, oftentimes you have more data to be able to anchor your conversation, to be able to anchor your story a little better, and the data could be qualitative, could be how customers are using, what's the feedback you're getting, which could be very, very informative, at least in the early formative years of a company. Two is a lot of quantitative data as well, like could be more usage numbers, health of the business, financials and stuff like that, right? Those things are more deterministic in nature and help automatically give like a structure to your discussion and so on. So a lot of this I feel may be more relevant in much more earlier stages where maybe data is not adequate enough, where you are actually there's more narrative, or there's a lot of this stuff that is yet to be played out or yet to be proven out in some sense. That is where I feel maybe this may play out a bigger role. But I think we spoke about CVs a little bit, right? I will draw a parallel here. Why do, like, all of us maybe would have at all times prepared a CV? We have like even evaluated CVs to hire people in our teams. The corollary to this is, look, job is also very high stakes. I have done a lot of work. Why shouldn't I create a 10-page CV? Wouldn't that improve my odds of saying, let me tell you every single thing I've done? It'll give you more data points on why I may be a very good candidate for something, right? But oftentimes we don't, because we feel sometimes that I have limited attention span. I may, like the hiring manager in a particular scenario, you have to take a call much sooner. So you may first do a very quick screening exercise to see, is this even broadly a fit for me? If you feel, look, this is okay on screening, let me go take a slightly deeper look here. And then I will iteratively feel like, oh, if that also feels okay, let me come meet you and I'll spend more time on each aspect of it. Oftentimes the way we evaluate like each other or choosing to work with people, choosing to work with anyone is a very iterative process where you first do a quick pass to see if it's relevant, not relevant, to just be more efficient and mindful of your own time. And then as it feels slightly more relevant, you keep going deeper and deeper. I think the same principle applies here, right? In some form, while the fear and the subsequent actions might be understood, I think what you need to understand, if someone did this to you, you wouldn't appreciate it. You would want the appropriate amount of information at the appropriate step, because you also have, let's say, limited time in the day, you're trying to optimize and so on, right? Which is why I think the approach I said is, look, figure out where you are in a particular process. If your job is to, let's say, get a meeting, solve for that, which means you may need to just tease and build a teaser to get to the next stage. If your job is, let's say, have an in-person meeting, how do I get someone hooked enough to, let's say, go to the next level? So approaching this in a more iterative way to say that, look, what is the next level of objective here? How do I solve that? I feel is a far more practical and useful way to approach this than overloading someone with information, because across a whole bunch of contexts, all of us are time poor in some sense and attention poor. We have multiple things going on in life. How do you just make it feel relevant in the moment and land the message in the least amount of effort? I think that is where the magic lies. It's not an easy thing to do. I feel this is one of those pursuits which is asymptotic in nature. Like, there may be people good at it, there may be people not so good at it, there are people aspiring to be good at it, but no one ever is good. Like, there's like a lifelong pursuit in some sense of saying, how do I keep doing this better and better and better, and always tend towards it, but you'll never actually maybe, let's say, get there. But that pursuit itself is very worthy, because it, I think, helps give that clarity to you. Usually you're better off for doing it. But I think the job at a broad level is to say that it's a tough one, and but you can actually make it happen. And I think taking this very iterative approach and solving for the next step is a more practical guide to approach such a situation.
नहीं ये काफ़ी सही बात है यार, because while you were speaking also, and I think this is a fair point, once I have probably raised a round or I have already bootstrapped my company to a level, then obviously I have so many data points to actually speak about कि भाई मैं actual random modeling पे बात नहीं कर रहा हूँ कि अरे ये कुछ कुछ हो जाएगा. You have actually, you know, proof of your work now with you, which is far better extrapolated in future rather than not, you know, while you're just ideating. But I think one of the other things also probably I would love to, you know, we can spend that, you know, small amount of time on that is, a lot of times when people are known, it is easier to probably sell or tell your story better. But a lot of people who might come up with a view कि यार चलो ये चीज़ सॉल्व करते हैं, क्योंकि देखो आइडिया है, किसी को भी आ सकता है, कोई भी पैशनेट हो सकता है. They might not be part of the circles as we say. A lot of people struggle in just getting an introduction. And I'm sure from a VC side, you may have a lot of people who are just approaching you constantly. What are like top 2-3 things or probably your hacks to figure out कि good thing is getting filtered to you, good connections are getting filtered to you? Because look, I'm sure, and I've seen this also, a lot of people, while even writing a check is a very late stage outcome people hear about. उससे पहले बहुत steps होते हैं, आप due diligence करते हो, बहुत तरीके के references check करते हो, उनकी team के, founders के, उनके past के, a lot of that. But a lot of people who are starting something, coming back to my question, they might not have the introduction or the circle to reach out to a VC. क्या वो हसल करके ही कोशिश, मतलब क्या हसल करके आप तक पहुंचते हैं या पहुंचना चाहिए, या how can they actually solve that problem?
Yeah, there are many ways to actually do this. Firstly, I would say that this problem may have been more stark a few years ago, and I do think India may not have had the adequate amount of capital to support the level of risk taking that was taking place. But I think over the last decade, we have seen massive progress here, right? We now have funds who serve almost all, right? From saying that, so there are funds and there are investors who focus purely on idea stage ones to all the way up to, let's say, an IPO and so on, right? There are funds who focus on specific sectors now, because you realize, look, let me differentiate and I understand this sector certain better than others. So I feel now we have enough depth in many ways of institutional formal investors playing across the spectrum of stages, of risk appetites, of sectors and so on. And I also think that we've also had a really nice sort of depth and evolution in the whole angel investor ecosystem, both in terms of quality and quantity in that sense, where I think a lot of people, let's say, who have had early success have also chosen to give back, both in terms of time and money, to help a lot of these folks. Folks in, let's say, more traditional businesses who have seen more successes have also chosen to participate in some of this, as a way to both get an idea of what's happening in, let's say, the new economy in some sense, plus also learn more about it and give back and mentor and so on, right? So from that standpoint, I feel this pain point or what you're talking about has reduced in complexity, and I think we've also seen a lot of this change at the grassroots level, both enabled by government grants, what SIDBI is actually like participated and supported a lot of funds right now. A bunch of state governments actually do this as well. There are a lot of these angel investor communities plus institutional investor communities, even in smaller cities right now. So I feel this access as a pain point has reduced. That said, look, as a founder, you're solving many, many difficult problems. The first difficult problem, you're trying to go find customers, figure out if they actually have the problem, persuade them that you might be the right way to solve their problem. Oftentimes, you may have access to this customer, you may not have access to this customer, right? You're going to again have to do either cold reach outs here, figure out a way to get a connect, do a lot of those kind of things here. Second thing is you're going to have to hire and build your team, because very rarely you'll be able to accomplish a lot of this stuff by yourself. Oftentimes you'll have to hire people who have skill sets in areas you're actually quite unaware about or deeply uncomfortable about. Let's say there's a founder who's great at product management or business, but he also needs to build a finance team, he may need to build a legal team. He or she will have to, let's say, build maybe marketing, which may not be their forte. You have to go outside your comfort zone to go hire great people in all of those to be able to allow you to collectively succeed. So as a founder, I don't think this problem in that sense is restricted only to access to investors. While it feels like money is a very key part that is holding you back, I feel there are equally important problems in many sense of the same kind of access problem to be solved, both in terms of hiring in areas that may not be your competence at the moment, or could be in terms of even customers and reaching customers and acquiring customers. I think the founder's ability to go create this access, be resourceful, is a great proxy also for an investor to say that, look, you can actually go make a lot of this stuff happen in some sense.
This is also a problem statement you were supposed to solve, na?
Yes, because the capital part I agree is a pain point, and there should be structural ways to reduce all of those where like the capital should flow to the right kind of ideas and all of those. But beyond the point, I also think that these are problems that are more feature in nature, and founders will encounter these, like especially let's say finding customers, reaching customers, hiring great employees. All of those will, I think it's all like structurally it's all very similar kind of problems. And a founder who's usually also great at, let's say, the part of like finding customers not easy to get to, and or hiring people not, let's say, directly in their network circle and able to do a great job, are also likely to be here. I think it's the same sort of common skill set of being tenacious, being resourceful, turning every stone. You've seen tons of people. If you, by the way, you open YouTube right now or you open Insta, there are so many people actually teaching you, saying, how do you write a great cold email? How do you do a great cold reach out? A lot of this knowledge is actually getting democratized right now. I think that's helping. Plus, general founder resourcefulness is also, I think, a big factor. I think as an ecosystem, we'll keep getting better and better at all of this. So the access problem, I think, will keep becoming less severe as we go along. And I feel the collective learnings of the whole ecosystem being trickled down from, let's say, a lot of mentors and folks who give back this knowledge in different form factors will also help basically. But beyond that, I feel some of these fights are worth fighting, and I think founders will go through that, I would say, battle in some sense to test themselves to see can they come out on the other side and can they do a great job here, because it's a good proxy to also show what is to come later.
Yeah, this is such a fair point, and I think we can probably conclude this part of the discussion, because look, I also wanted to bring this up because I get frustrated when a lot of people ask a how question, what question. तो why question पूछना ना मुझे उसमें बहुत interest आता है. Why is forcing you to think more deeply. Probably if you're asking me, then probably you may have expected कि मैं थोड़ा सा deeply सोच के आपको बताऊं, या आप नहीं बता पा रहे हो. यार, how to reach, what to do while doing a cold reach out, ये सब चीज़ें explained है अच्छे से. तो अगर आप नहीं कर रहे हो ना, तो मुझे लग रहा है या तो डिसिप्लिन और या तो जनरल लेजीनेस का प्रॉब्लम है कि आप वो नहीं कर पा रहे हो. एंड अगेन एज यू सेड ना राइटली कि यार अगर तुम कस्टमर्स एक्वायर करने की सोच रहे हो जो हार्ड टू गेट हैं, तो ये भी तो एक तरीके की प्रॉक्सी है ना. तो मतलब आर यू सेइंग कि तुम्हारे सर्कल में वो लोग नहीं थे तो तुम यू कुड नॉट रीच आउट, विच इज सच अ फेयर पॉइंट ऑफ सेइंग. बट थैंकफुली लुक, यू ऑल्सो एक्सप्लेन्ड कि यार आई थिंक एज ह्यूमंस वी आर ऑल ड्रिवन बाय अ लॉट ऑफ स्टोरी टेलिंग एंड वी लव हेयरिंग स्टोरीज. तो जब आप अपना डेक किसी को दिखा रहे हो, या यू आर एक्सपेक्टिंग समबडी टू रीड योर पिच डेक, it should be like a story they're reading, and that story should make sense, and as outcome it should feel like यार ये जो भी founder है या set of founders हैं इनसे मिलते हैं, let's try and have a next conversation. I think if you can just achieve that as part of a story, then I think the strength of your product, your market will anyway take you to next level, and then you can figure out भाई funding करनी है नहीं करनी है, लेनी है नहीं लेनी है. Cool. तो ये तो देखो ये बात हमारी बढ़िया हो गई. मतलब this is something I really wanted you to speak on. But one of the other things also which I have felt, and again probably I'm just thinking more through from a pitch deck, investing, all of that, is also when a lot of people, they're trying to give you a sense of the market. तो हम अभी इंडिया स्पेसिफिक बात कर रहे हैं. A lot of people would compare what has happened in US. A lot of people would then also compare what has happened in China. I agree कि बहुत सारी चीज़ें हैं जो हम लोग वेस्टर्न हेमिस्फेयर से भी इन्फ्लुएंस होके सोचते हैं. But India context is a very different context. Like this, I'm not saying just because I'm an Indian कि India जैसी कोई country नहीं है. But I'm saying the ecosystem, the world of India is very different. How valuable or important it is to probably do what has happened in US, what has happened in China, given that यार हमारे लोगों का behavior इंडिया में जो हमारे consumers होंगे वो बहुत different, बहुत alien होगा. So how do you think about such things? Because people spend a lot of time doing this. Is that valuable, and how do you think about it?
Sid, I think there's ये तो बहुत सही point है. Short answer in my mind, the way I think of it is very valuable, but it has to be taken in the right context, which oftentimes I think doesn't necessarily end up happening. You may take some of those learnings literally and try applying them here. That may not work. Ideally, one needs to zoom out to appreciate the context in which those learnings, those events in those countries may have played out, right? I think there are lots of valuable lessons in that, to remember that if in such a scenario, if A is true, B is true, then this happened, then you extrapolate, let's say, to an India context, say, look, of that, only A is true here, maybe B is not true here. So hence, maybe this is what I think, maybe things may play out here, right? So I'll not, of course, try to reinvent the wheel and reject everything that's happened out there, but I'll be smart about it and actually peel the layers of the onion a little more and say, look, what exactly happened there, in what time, in what scenario, what circumstance, normalize for it, and then try to apply the lessons to India. I feel going both extremes is not right, which is one to say I'll reject all learnings from everything abroad, because then you're going to reinvent the wheel a lot. Number two is to say that they have figured everything out and that is going to be exactly applied. I don't think that works as well. And I think more and more it's become obvious to us as the domestic market in India has actually evolved over the last 10-20 years, and all of us are seeing that around us, is that it's fairly heterogeneous now in some way. There are a lot of very unique nuances about the way India itself operates, right?
Right.
So appreciating all of those context points, acknowledging for all of them, there'll be some universal learnings that will be true abroad, that'll be true in the US, China, Europe, and true in India. There'll be some stuff that may be not true there but true here, and vice versa, right? So I think just taking those learnings and actively acknowledging it, getting ahead of it and solving for it, I think definitely can massively improve your odds of success.
So just continuing this point a little more, what in your opinion or in your experience you have seen are things or behaviors which are very unique to India? Look, I don't want to just come across as a person ki yaar, arey bhaiya, India is the greatest country type. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying, I feel, look, I've also decently well traveled. You've also very, very well traveled. India is a very unique country. And thus the behaviors of consumers would also be very unique. Have you come across like couple of those things which should be kept in mind while not just thinking यार US में ऐसा हुआ है तो यहाँ पे ऐसे ही करेंगे? Like one of the things which are very, very obvious is यार the per capita GDP of say US and China is very different than what that is of India. But people might argue नहीं यार, मैं जो वो हम इंडिया को ब्रेक करते हैं 1, 2, 3 में, तो 1 वाली जनता तो बिल्कुल US की तरह है. I think even after that, there must be attributes, characteristics of just Indian consumers which are very unique to us.
Correct.
Have you come across like some of them, and can you speak about them?
Look, I think that's a very, very fair point, and I think segmenting and looking, of course, is one level of I would say, consensus learning that all of us collectively have had over the years. Earlier, we would speak of it as one common blob. Now we break it into categories and say, "Alag baat karte hain, India 1, 2, 3." But even within that, some traits I think are universal.
यार वही
I
मैं बोल
think
रहा हूँ ना, तब भी वो बहुत सरफेस लेवल डिस्कशन है.
I agree. Like for example, see, I think we spoke a lot about this at Cred, and I think we tried actively solving for it in some way. I think a big variable that comes through here is actually just trust as a variable, right? And Kunal has of course spoken a lot about it, both on Twitter, both otherwise. But I still feel it's a fairly underappreciated, not as well understood sort of attribute in some sense. So maybe I think we should spend a few minutes talking about
Please
it,
do,
right?
please do.
So I think the general trust deficit that exists in the country at so many levels, one is to say that look, it is what it is and it slowly will improve over time, basically, given we have come a long way from where we were. But to say that, how do you acknowledge that this is a real pain point for a lot of people and how do you get ahead of it to solve, right? We'll talk about what we both did a little bit at Cred, right? I think one nuance that some of these create is, I think, one, it creates either completely new needs in some sense, or it creates context. Like for example, you see Indians being very value conscious in some sense. In some cases, let's say where stakes are high, they might just be price insensitive to an extent or to a degree where some of those. So you see some of these behaviors playing out in those contexts. These may differ from how people operate in those dimensions outside India. Like for example, how people trust other people, how people trust brands, when are they price conscious, when are they value conscious, when does, let's say, maybe price and some of these things trump a lot of other variables in some sense. So we'll maybe talk about it a little bit. Couple of examples I think come to mind, right? For us at Cred, I think the early product we had built was this whole product around credit card management, where we were basically reminding a lot of users on their due dates and helping them pay their bills on time. Now, what looks like a very simple feature saying that, hey, why is this such a big deal? Credit card bill का date याद रखना इतनी बड़ी बात क्या है? ये payment करना थोड़ी बड़ी बात है, right? But what I think we don't appreciate, there's that very disproportionate fear which is conditioned in all of our minds. वो एक Twitter पे, I'm not sure if all of you have seen that meme or that joke, right? Like where होटल मिनी बार से मैं कुछ भी कंज्यूम कर लूँ तो मेरी पूरी फैमिली बैंकरप्ट हो जाएगी वाला जो फियर है, राइट?
Yeah.
I feel that same thing in some sense to a degree applies for credit card, where you say यार मैं अगर क्रेडिट कार्ड बिल पे ना करूँ पता नहीं मेरी फैमिली के साथ क्या हो जाएगा टाइप है. Where the fear seems slightly more disproportionate to how actually bad it may be as an act. And interestingly, a lot of due dates for a lot of banks don't coincide on the same day. You want to optimize for offers, acceptance, and so on. So you may have one card from the bank which gives you a salary account. You have one card on which you get like nice offers around the sale periods in the year, and you have multiple cards like this. Most likely the due dates may not be on the same date, right? Now, because you have this fear on one side saying मेरी पूरी फैमिली bankrupt हो जाएगी, and आपको दो डेट याद रखना है. If someone comes and says यार मैं वो cognitive load हटा दूंगा, इसका अपसाइड कम है बट डाउनसाइड काफी ज्यादा है, आपके मन में परसीव डाउनसाइड ज्यादा है, you actually solve that problem, you're like, oh wow, thank you. And the reason all of this is happening in the first place is because of this trust deficit we talked about. There's an option on all cards to set up standing instructions, auto debit, and so on. Historically, we have been a very cautious society in some sense, and I think a lot of our financial institutions may have borne the brunt of it. And users have been, I would say, compared to a lot of countries abroad, where the number of users who give some of these permissions to do these standing instructions of debiting your due amount on your card every month, that number is much lower in India.
Oh, it's very, very low.
Correct. The last I've heard is it's somewhere in that like single digit number, maybe it's reached double digits
Teens,
right now.
teens mein, teens.
And maybe it's in that like sub 20% is my broad guess. And this number, I would hazard a guess to say it's much higher in the countries abroad, right? So because you may not have that supreme level of trust, and you may be like, look, I want to see my bill once before paying. I want to check कि कुछ गलत तो नहीं आया है, सब सही है ना. That creates an entire opportunity. That single step of not trusting enough and that trust deficit creates an opportunity to take this fear away and manage this whole cognitive load in a much better way, and has allowed a large company to end up being built in this space, right? And a lot of what Cred's been able to do is to use some of those trust deficits in a lot of other products to be able to build the right kind of products in those categories as well. You actually, let's talk beyond Cred, right?
Yeah.
If we talk beyond Cred, a very classic example that always comes to mind for me is Tanishq. In the late 90s, early 2000s, when I think the common default behavior is actually buying gold and buying jewelry from your local jeweler, because yeah, trust hai. 3 generations, 4 generations से वो like jeweler has been doing that. So you're like, we know their family or we know that they've been doing this. The shop has been exactly here for so long. That trust was continuing for a very long time. When Tanishq came and they were backed by Tata, of course, a very, very trusted brand. But the part they were realizing is that folks are not trusting them as much. And they actually felt like they're still going to their local jeweler who has higher level of trust there. Now, gold is a very ingrained part of India society, very different from countries abroad. This need is not as pervasive where individuals go buy gold for as much. In India, they buy it for various reasons, store of value, jewelry, weddings, and so many other things, right? An insight, at least like Tanishq had at that time, was to say that look, there's a lot of perhaps adulteration that's there. A lot of this gold that people may have, it may not be 24 karat, may not be at least the grade and purity that they think. And they come up with this carat meter. They come check whether your gold is pure or not, and you had the option to go exchange that. And they basically took this as a nice mechanism to get people trained here and then become like that epitome of trust in some sense. And I think that played out beautifully for them. You should look at like Tanishq and Titan share price from the late 90s, early 2000s to where it is now. And the fact that now it just feels like that is the normal behavior where they could actually break that perceived behavior of who should be trusted and move it in a way where they could influence it and offer a much, much better solution for customers. And I think that's a big, big example of how actually this plays out, right? And I would say in so many other scenarios, I feel some of what happens in India behavior is very unique. I'll talk about a couple of companies within the Elevation portfolio where I've seen this play out. I'll talk about this company called Spinny, right? And they're basically in the used car basically space.
Right.
And they're one of the larger companies that enables in that space and fairly loved, good feedback from customers. I think the pain point there's been a bunch of places in this whole auto space, auto commerce space in some ways, who have been there as marketplaces for a very long time, who have been solving it. Their realization again was that look, trust is a big problem. You don't know who the third party is, who's the other counterparty. You have to deal with multiple people. Can I trust that person? Will they pay me on time? What if they're selling me? Like there's some issue there and I have not fully been able to check or I have not been fully able to vet, and I realized 1 month later, 6 months later कि कुछ गड़बड़ था and मेरे पैसे डूब गए. High stakes, car is such a personal thing for you. You don't want to make a mistake here.
Plus aspirational भी है ना बहुत लोगों को.
Correct. It's very aspirational. You feel stakes are very high. Downside seems very, very high. So there's value for a player to come and saying that look, we can buy the car from you. We can actually pay you the money upfront. We'll go be very disciplined. We'll inspect all of it. We'll be very transparent with you about it. We'll offer you a price. Should you choose to accept, you're willing to purchase the car. And if you're actually purchasing a pre-owned vehicle from us, we actually will give you warranty on it. Which again solves the trust problem to say that what if something happens later. So all of these are, I think, it's a very asset heavy, more full stack approach to solving a problem that's existed for so long. But that is the kind of second level, third level diagnosis that is needed. Plus these kind of, I would say, very customer first solutions to those nuances, traits that are very unique to this country in the way they've evolved, which I think are great ways to solve problems basically. And I actually think that if you go look at a lot of the companies who have been successful, if you look under the hood, it may not be obvious at the top, but you'll realize there would be some or the other nuances that they would have 100% solved for, which are very unique to these customers, which shows the deeper level of understanding of their fears, aspirations, and some way they've solved that in a very elegant way, which has in some way allowed them to be more successful. Of course, talking about companies that serve the domestic Indian market much more than the ones who...
नहीं तो ये तो बिल्कुल आश्रय, मैं तो चाहता हूँ कि we should be talking about Indian markets also, because the amount of knowledge we have for whoever is trying to earn that knowledge, a lot has been spoken about US market, a lot has been spoken about say Asian market, China market. India market में ना जनता सिर्फ सीधे celebration पे जाती है, उसके depth में जाके discuss नहीं करती. And I think trust is a big problem which we've been conditioned to think that way. I think मैं तो last 5-6 साल में I've been conditioned to think like that. And plus I was also thinking it, just tying this back to fintech and how we were trying to solve also. I was just discussing this with somebody else the other day also. I think you need essentially two things to win in a fintech ecosystem. You need the consumer to at least have trust with you, or have really, really high delta for experience with you. Banks के साथ क्या होता है? Why do we see that everybody keeps their liabilities with, or their savings with banks, because inherently trust है ना, ट्रस्ट इंडिया के लिए बहुत ज़्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट है. बट अब आप कोई फिनटेक चालू कर रहे हो तो आपके ऊपर ट्रस्ट थोड़ी ना कोई करेगा. दैट इज हाउ यू कैन ओनली गेट इन टू द ट्रस्ट साइकिल, बाय बीइंग रियली रियली impressive in terms of what you're offering, as like how you're helping them solve a problem. And when you keep solving that really really nice, that is how you build trust over time. And such companies, I feel, will do exceptionally well, because experience wale मामले में ना, unfortunately in my opinion, a lot of financial institutions have not done really delta 4 exercise there. मतलब they've been reactive in terms of tailwinds or how technology has evolved. But at the forefront of how technology will get implemented, I think a lot of these startups, fintechs, have done really, really well. So this was my thought while you were speaking also. So I really, really appreciate that point. But मेरे मुंह से जब मैं बोल रहा था तो मेरे को tailwinds मेरे दिमाग में एक आया, and this was a thought I wanted to actually pick up with you also. I think a lot of times लोग सोचते हैं कि tailwinds के basis पे, मतलब tailwinds को वो associate करते हैं कि यार यहाँ investing हो रही है. Like a lot of times, like right now in 2024, we see a lot of people investing in a lot of these startups which are AI focused. थोड़े साल पहले तक, I think last decade भी पकड़ लेते हैं मोटा मोटा, a lot of consumer and financial technology led companies were getting invested. Is tailwind based investing an outcome, or is it more proactive, like while investing side से? क्योंकि हम तो देखो बाहर बैठे हैं, मैंने तो कभी इन्वेस्टिंग की नहीं है. ऐसा लगता है कि अच्छा सब लोगों को एआई में अगर अभी कंपनी आप बना रहे हो तो इन्वेस्टिंग हो रही है. बट इज इट अ कॉन्शियस कॉल व्हेन यू आर इन्वेस्टिंग टू बी अलाइंड टू टेलविंड्स, और इज इट a reactive observation which we see and try and join the dots, and it is not intentional?
Yeah, I think when a lot of founders may start this, I've actually seen founders start this because there are tailwinds. I've also seen founders start and focus on areas because it's just something that's very deep and personal to them in some way, right? But that said, if you ask me, one has a choice about the matter. What should one do? Which is a more practical sort of call to discuss, right? I feel taking advantage of tailwinds is a no-brainer. Starting a company is a very, very hard thing to do. You're effectively fighting against all odds. We all have spoken about, and there's enough material, content, literature, everything out there that talks about how hard starting up is, what is the mortality rates of startups. All of those things are fairly well known, right? I think it almost seems like you're swimming against the current in a river. Right? If you had the option to, let's say, swim with the current a little bit, why would you not take it? I think all of us in that sense, it's just smarter to adopt the path of least resistance in some sense. So from that standpoint, I think taking advantage of tailwinds, I think, is a very smart call.
But आश्रय देख, वो तो incidental है ना, कि यार मैं जो प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व कर रहा था उसके सॉल्यूशन में आई कुड फिगर आउट सम टेलविंड्स, एंड दैट माइट सॉल्व अ टाइमिंग प्रॉब्लम और इन्वेस्टिंग प्रॉब्लम, कि यार मैं पैसे उठा सकता हूँ इसके लिए. बट वाइल इन्वेस्टिंग साइड से, is following tailwinds a proactive effort by a lot of VCs in the country? कि यार अच्छा अभी मैं AI चल रहा है तो मैं AI पे कुछ भी करेगा तो I will invest. Like, is that true?
See, I think there are two things to think through.
क्योंकि मैं यार फाउंडर के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू तो ऑब्वियसली यूज करूँगा, आई एग्री. बट मैं समझना चाह रहा हूँ तेरे से कि फ्रॉम एन इन्वेस्टिंग साइड, डू पीपल प्रोएक्टिवली ट्राई एंड सी अच्छा यार इस चीज़ की हवा चली है, मतलब आई एम जस्ट मेकिंग इट रियली ट्रिवियल राइट नाउ, इस चीज़ की हवा चल रही है तो अभी अब इसमें डिसेंट कोई आइडिया भी होगा तो मैं इन्वेस्ट करूँगा. लाइक यू रिमेंबर देयर वाज अ टाइम वेयर एवरीबडी, एटलीस्ट इट फेल्ट लाइक फ्रॉम द आउटसाइड, एवरीबडी इन क्रिप्टो करेंसी, कोई भी स्टार्टअप कर रहे हो, पीपल वर गेटिंग फंडेड. नाउ नोबडी इज गेटिंग फंडेड mostly.
Look, I think there are two things to think about here. I think the question is very fair, where I can understand why a lot of folks may have this thought sitting outside, right, and watching this more dispassionately as a third-party observer. I think there are tailwinds and sometimes there are, let's say, hype cycles. And I think both of those things may be slightly different. They may happen at the same time, they may happen together, but they may not necessarily be the same thing. Tailwinds is a very, I would say, in some way, factual sort of thing to do, which is to say that, look, there has been a change in regulations in some form which makes something not possible earlier possible right now.
Okay, I get it now.
There is basically, let's say, some change in customer behavior. Let's say, for example, in India, the advent of Jio, cheap internet, high quality internet was a big
those
tailwind.
are tailwinds.
These are very factual in nature, these are very deterministic in nature, right? Oftentimes these coincide also, because with tailwinds usually you say that look, there's a gold rush, you've figured out, a lot of these smart people sometimes figure out that look, this is a great opportunity, which is when a lot of people jump onto the opportunity to do something about it. Sometimes in that, to like folks outside or even to folks inside, it may not be so obvious on something which is fairly futuristic to say which of these may be more successful or what is the right approach to solve this problem.
उनको वो hype लग सकता है.
Because that stuff is still getting figured out by everyone. For example, what we are seeing with AI right now, I think it's a lot more real. Look, a lot of the hard work that's been going on here has been, from what I understand, I'm not an expert on the space, has been going on for many years right now. But now we have seen convincing examples of how that could add value in a lot of our lives, right?
True,
and when
true.
it starts adding value in our lives, then is when we are feeling that, oh, look, something has changed. Maybe we should do something about it. Or it may spark a lot of ideas in a lot of people to say, look, I can use this to maybe be able to do something like this, right? So I think these may coincide. As investors, our endeavor always is to say that, look, what's the best way to make returns for our investors in some sense, right? In the best way of managing risk and reward in the right way. Our job at all times is to be cognizant and be aware. And sometimes, look, tailwinds are not overnight activities. Sometimes they may be, sometimes they are not. Look, a lot of adverse regulation sometimes may be like negative for somebody but positive for somebody else, and those may happen suddenly. Some of these may be some time in the making. So there are people, if you're deep in a space, if you've spent a lot of time there, it's possible that you may have a head start in terms of understanding, and you may have a head start in terms of saying, oh, it looks like all signs are pointing towards something like this changing. The world around me in this context may change in this particular way, and I have a high confidence guess, a medium confidence guess to say that something like this may happen. And then you say that, look, if I'm early to it, and if I've identified some of those insights, and if I then find the right team that, like, basically I feel can execute very well, tap into all of those, has all the right attributes, has all the right ideas in terms of how should they go to market, how should they be capital efficient, how do you build a viable business model. If all of those things come together along with the tailwind, then I think you have a winning combination. So the approach at all times is to, I don't think, ever forget the basics, which is to say you need a great team, you need like a viable model, you need all of those, but that in conjunction with some of these tailwinds that may be obvious to you, or that's something you're picking up after doing a lot of work, is something I think is a fairly deliberate strategy as well in a lot of scenarios. The second strategy could be, I would say, to take a very counter example, there are some things which are very basic human needs in some sense, which you think will never change. Those are stuff which will just keep getting better, right? We keep talking about like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We talk about roti, kapda, makan and things like that, right? ये तो हमेशा चाहिए, ये पहले भी चाहिए था, आज भी चाहिए. Like you can talk about spaces which people say are evergreen, like maybe healthcare, maybe education and all of those. Come what may, in spite of cycles in some sense, some of these needs are very essential. So there are people who are always pushing, making incremental changes, pushing, and some of those things sometimes adds up. So I feel both company creation and the way investors look at it is a fairly holistic view. Being boxed in and being like going after only one thing and putting all your eggs in one basket is also never a, I would say, fully wise call. But I do think investors are more thoughtful and deliberate about taking advantage of these tailwinds, and sometimes you may also take the counter view and sort of think through to actually say that what might never change. Like Jeff Bezos keeps saying, what is going to be true now, what will be true 10 years later, to 20 years later. You may also think through around some of those aspects. And I think we'll tie all of this thing ultimately to say that, like, is this a great founder? Do we feel we can work with the founder? Do we have a good idea of how do we create value? All of this sort of stuff ties together to your final decision.
Makes a lot of sense. First of all, look, I'm one of the things which I've always been fascinated has been, how people generally look at investing in the country. I think, we should discuss probably some other day why in our country specifically we celebrate funding as a big news, as a very positive news, although the founder is essentially diluting their ownership of the company with an investor. And I'm not just saying VC, but it could be any other form of investing. But I think, look, I'm really thankful that, we spoke about a couple of these things. I think a lot of people generally have a very basic surface level understanding of a lot of things. I think one of the things I really wanted to drive, and thankfully you have helped me explain that really, really well in a very articulative manner, is कि यार पिच डेक भी तुम्हारा एक प्रोडक्ट ही है. मतलब प्लीज़ उसको एक आफ्टर थॉट की तरह मत देखो. तुम आफ्टर थॉट की तरह देखोगे तो फिर इन्वेस्टर भी तुम्हें आफ्टर थॉट के हिसाब से देखेगा. एंड आई थिंक वाई आई ब्रॉड इन द CV पार्ट ऑल्सो इन द बिगनिंग ऑल्सो वॉज अ फैक्ट कि थिंक लाइक हायरिंग मैनेजर ऑल्सो. तुम 25,000 100 CVs देख रहे होगे ना, तो फिर कैसे आपका CV स्टैंड आउट करेगा. थिंक ऑफ इट लाइक दिस. आई थिंक एन इन्वेस्टर इज ऑल्सो गोइंग थ्रू सो मेनी पिच टेक्स दैट अगर आप वर्बोस और इस तरीके से बनाओगे तो आई थिंक यू स्पोक अबाउट अ लॉट ऑफ दोस थिंग्स. तो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल थैंक यू फॉर डूइंग दैट.
No, I think firstly said thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Uh, it's always, I think, good to talk about topics which are less spoken about. And the endeavor with this is to, at least in some way, with my limited experience of what I do, share some views of how at least the world I have seen. And maybe it helps a few people understand the world a little better and tailor their actions and what they do a little better, and maybe simplifies how different stakeholders think and helps them act in some way, basically, right? And especially I think founders have already a very, very hard job. The more I think things are simplified or the higher level of understanding you have, then you can actually focus on the core substance of actually building, which is a hard enough activity in itself. So in
Right.
that sense, I hope this activity is slightly helpful to viewers and the folks basically listening to this. And I think the questions are also fairly thought provoking, less discussed. So from that standpoint, I think great questions. It's a pleasure thinking through, answering, and I hope I did an okay job sort of at least conveying my limited experience on some of these.
Awesome. Chalo, let's do it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, bhai.
Chalo.
Thanks for watching the video. If you like the video, please press the like button, subscribe if you like it, and if you can share it with your friends, I'll be really happy about it. We are working really hard to make good videos, and hopefully future videos will be as exciting as the one you just saw. Thank you.